Nancy Cordes, Ed O'Keefe, and Anita Kumar join me now. Nancy is CBS News chief congressional correspondent. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent with the president-elect Joe Biden in Delaware, and Anita is a White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico. Welcome to you all. Before we continue with stimulus talks, Ed, I understand we have some breaking news about an investigation into President-elect Joe Biden's son, Hunter. What do we know so far?
Yeah, Elaine, a little more than an hour ago, the Biden-Harris transition team released a statement from the president-elect's son saying, I'll just read from this, that he learned yesterday that he is the subject of an ongoing federal investigation into, quote, my tax affairs. I take this matter very seriously, but I am confident that a professional and objective review of these matters will demonstrate that I handled my affairs legally and appropriately, including with the benefit of professional tax advisors. The transition office also released a statement on behalf of the president-elect saying that the president-elect is, quote, deeply proud of his son, who has fought through difficult challenges, including the vicious personal attacks of recent months, only to emerge stronger. So again, the headline is that Hunter Biden confirms he's the subject of an ongoing federal investigation into his taxes. It's being led by prosecutors here in Wilmington, just a few blocks from where we are right now. Remember, he has been under sort of a cloud of PR and other and sort of congressional intrigue, if you will, for the last year or so, as there have been questions about work that he had done in China and the Ukraine while his father was vice president. He was the subject of a Senate investigation that found no wrongdoing, subject of several press investigations that also found no wrongdoing, but certainly pointed to it being an example of the son of a senior government official possibly taking advantage of or being given better access to foreign officials given his family ties. Now comes this federal investigation into his taxes, likely to focus on questions about how he made so much money overseas working for these Chinese and Ukrainian energy companies.
All right, we'll continue to follow it. Meanwhile, Ed, as we reported yesterday, President-elect Biden made the official announcement of retired General Lloyd Austin for Secretary of Defense. Now, Congress would need to pass a waiver to allow General Austin to fill the role designed for civilians since he hasn't been out of the military long enough. Well, here's Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth, an Iraq War veteran, this afternoon. Let's listen.
I will support General Austin, but I will not support the waiver.
Well, without the waiver, how would he be able to serve?
Well, he would not be able to, but I suspect that that the waiver will pass. I will not vote for the waiver. I believe very strongly that there need to be civilian control, civilian oversight of the military, and by reducing the wait times from 10 years to 7 years, we did that in 2007 without any input, and now again for a second Secretary of Defense in a row to request another waiver. I just can't support that on principle. I will tell you.
So, Ed, what is President-elect Biden saying about his pick?
Sure. And first of all, that waiver is what the House and Senate would have to pass in order to exempt Austin from this federal law that bars military personnel from holding senior civilian positions at the Pentagon for at least 7 years after they leave the ranks. George Marshall got it in the 1950s after he'd served as Secretary of State and was being moved to the Pentagon. And then James Mattis got it in 2017, not 2007, as the senator said there. Biden today, Mr. Biden today asking Congress to do it again, saying that the times call for it and that he knows and he can vouch for the fact that the former general understands the importance of civilian control. Notably, the general himself went out of his way to point that out, saying that when he took off his uniform 4 years ago, he understood that he was now a civilian and that he would keep that foremost in his mind should he become the first black man to lead the Pentagon. But there will be questions about this. There will be questions about his work in recent years with Raytheon as a board member at the defense contractor. There'll be questions about the fact that he was one of the first U.S. commanders to try to take on ISIS, was responsible for the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan and Iraq as well. But the history is unquestionable. There have been 200. When he was promoted to be a four-star Army general, he was the 200th person to receive that rank, to earn that rank, but he was only the 6th black man. And like I said, if he is confirmed, he'd be the first black man to lead the Pentagon.
And last night, you confirmed 2 more nominations for the Biden cabinet: Ohio Congresswoman Marcia Fudge for Housing and Urban Development Secretary, and former Obama Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack returning to his old role. Now, interestingly, Fudge was publicly campaigning for the role that went to Vilsack. So what's going on there?
Well, and it was really more of like Fudge associates, including House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, who's a good friend of hers and obviously a good friend of the president-elect, given the support that he's given Mr. Biden through the years. Ultimately, it was decided that she's going to go run HUD instead, at least in the view of Mr. Biden. He's not yet officially announced that, but we continue to be told that that is the plan. And by asking Vilsack to go back to his old job, Biden aides say this is designed to put somebody back in charge of a place that is actually at the forefront of a lot of the economic problems in this country right now. We're in the midst of the worst hunger crisis since the Great Depression. And while it's called the Agriculture Department, remember, it doles out tens of billions of dollars every year in federal food aid to the neediest, to school lunch programs, and to others. And with so much of this being a problem right now, they're very concerned about putting somebody in charge who can tackle that. Plus, of course, the economic plight, especially of smaller family farms across the country. That was part of his responsibilities as well during the Obama years.
All right, Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I know you have to get going. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Let's continue our conversation. Nancy, let me turn to you. Congresswoman Fudge is going to become the second House Democrat to leave for the Biden administration. Louisiana's Cedric Richmond is the other. Now, the party is heading into the next Congress with somewhere between a 9 and 11 seat majority. How quickly can those two be replaced, and how will that smaller majority impact the next Congress?
It's going to have a huge impact, Elaine. It looks at this point like Democrats are going to have the slimmest of majorities, as you mentioned, something like 220 to 213. That's the smallest majority they've had in a century. And what that means is that Speaker Pelosi can only afford to lose about 4 Democrats on any given vote if she wants to pass a piece of legislation. Put in another way, that's, she's one squad away from losing any legislative battle. And so, she is someone who is used to having more of a cushion, a couple dozen members who she could tell for whatever reason, this might be politically difficult for you to vote for, you're in a tight race, you don't have to vote for it, I'll release you to vote no. She's not really going to have that luxury this time around. And it is going to take several months to arrange special elections. Keep in mind, we are in the midst of a pandemic for both Fudge and Richmond. Now, they're both from safe Democratic districts, so everyone assumes that at the end of the day, those seats will be won by Democrats, and that'll give Speaker Pelosi a little more wiggle room. But certainly there's great concern at the leadership level about how many more House members the Biden administration plans to tap to serve, let's say, in the cabinet or other major positions, because every individual they take away has a big impact on what the Democrats can get done in the House.
Yeah, that political calculus becomes that much harder for Speaker Pelosi, as you pointed out. Well, Anita, as we await the results of Georgia's Senate runoffs, which will determine who controls that chamber, President-elect Biden is pledging to undo much of President Trump's changes to the U.S. immigration system the same way they were implemented, which is by executive order. But you have some new reporting on why it's not as simple as the stroke of a pen. Why is that?
Well, so many things that President Trump did were actually by rules and regulations, and that's a long bureaucratic process that could take months or a year or so to put into place, and it would take the same amount of time to undo. So a lot of the things that we're really familiar with, changes, more than 400 changes actually that President Trump pushed through, are going to be these long, cumbersome, policies that it will take a while to do. He's also going to face a lot of lawsuits. Just as President Trump faced a lot of lawsuits when he enacted some of these things, President-elect Biden is going to face lawsuits by groups that support President Trump and supported the policies he put in place. And so there will be a lot of things that we see like that. There are going to be some high-profile policies that we'll see President-elect Biden do on day one or that first week. He's going to stop funding to the border wall that President Trump really campaigned hard on and pushed through. We'll hear about things like the program that President Obama had for Dreamers, DACA, that President Trump tried to end and was not able to do so. And President-elect Biden has said he'll keep that in place, but he's going to face a lawsuit on that. So what we're seeing, and these are people on both sides of the issue that I'm talking to, both sides acknowledge that for 4 years, or the next 4 years, we're going to see fights over immigration policy, and some of them may take years to resolve. So it's not going to be as quick as people think.
Well, Nancy, let's talk about the legislative calendar here. So the Senate is set to adjourn next Friday, December 18th. What are the outstanding agenda items here before they leave? Of course, so many Americans, as we always say on Red and Blue and on CBSN, are watching Washington so closely at this point in time because of that stimulus bill.
Right. Some biggies that Congress needs to take care of before it gets out of town. I'll get to that COVID relief bill in a moment. But first, the main thing that they need to do is keep the lights on in government. They need to pass a government funding bill. They were supposed to do that this week that would have funded the government through next October, but the negotiators are still haggling over some outstanding items. So they passed a short-term bill that would buy them another week so they could keep talking. So they're hoping to pass that next week. They're hoping to have a COVID relief deal that they can attach to that spending bill and pass both of them at once. But negotiations over that package are really all over the place right now. You've got proposals coming from every direction, from the administration, from this bipartisan group of senators, and we're really at the point now where we shouldn't be looking at proposals. We should be looking at a draft of legislation, and they aren't even anywhere near that. And so it is looking like an uphill climb to come to some kind of agreement by the end of next week that is written up in legislative text and can pass, but it is a huge priority for a lot of people. So, there are a lot of people who are willing that to happen, and so let's see. And then finally, there's a separate big spending bill, a $730 billion bill to fund the military, and it includes an increase in pay for the troops and all the things that are required to keep the military going for another year. That passed the House yesterday. It's going to pass the Senate in a couple of days, but the big problem is that President Trump has threatened to veto that bill, which would be really a first, because he's concerned or upset that it doesn't include some unrelated provisions that would remove liability protections for tech companies. And so if he does follow through with that veto threat, let's say sometime next week, that is going to put Republicans in a pretty uncomfortable position, because they would then have to decide whether they're going to vote with Democrats to override that veto and go up against the president in a way they really haven't had to do before. And so the votes are there for them to override the veto. The question is whether Republicans will get cold feet or whether they will go through with it. So that's a lot on the agenda over the next week and a half. And of course, Americans watching so closely to see if after months of dithering and indecision, whether Congress can finally come together on some kind of relief package.
Anita, one last one for you here. On that defense bill that Nancy just mentioned, what is the thinking in the Trump administration right now with respect to that, given what Nancy just pointed out, which is that the numbers do not appear to be there for the president if, in fact, he does go ahead and decide to veto this bill?
Well, there were a lot of people that were wondering if the president was serious about the veto threat, and it appears that he is now, because we've seen it in writing from his administration putting that threat out there. This isn't a new issue for the president. He has talked about this for 4 years, that he feels like these tech companies are not fair, that they are censoring conservatives like himself, and that they should be held accountable for what they put out there. And so this is an issue he's talked about at a lot of different venues for the last 4 years. What has surprised people is that he's combining it with this bill, that he's putting something so important, the funding of the military, something he talks about also and supports, that he's saying that it must be part of this bill. What you're seeing Republicans say is, look, he's right. We support this effort that he, is pushing on these tech companies, but this isn't the place to do that. This isn't the venue to do that. Let this be a separate issue, a separate bill, or a separate, mechanism to address that. So there's some frustration from a lot of people on the combining of that, and they're saying, is he really going to go through with this, next week or so when this is? But I've talked to some people who say, look, look, this is very important to the president. He wants one last big win before he leaves office. This is something that would be his base would love to see and would support. And so why shouldn't he push this, push this issue that he's been talking about for so long, go out on a victory? But just like anything with this White House, there are a lot of people that disagree. There are people that say, look, let him have this last win if he gets it. There are people who are saying this is not the time or place to do that. So we'll see what the president ends up doing. But the fact that he has said it and now the administration has put it into a formal paperwork, really, that they have this veto threat seems to indicate that he would go that route next week if that's the case.
All right, it could all come to a head next week, it sounds like. Nancy Cordes and Anita Kumar, thank you both very much.